The night of the blood moon was not supposed to belong to Sarah Voss. She knew that. Everyone knew that. The daughters of great alphas had spent years preparing for this ceremony, stitching their finest robes, practicing their walks, rehearsing the graceful bow that tradition demanded. They had dreamed about this night since they were children. Sarah had spent the evening before it crouched behind a cold stone wall in the dark, listening to a conversation she was never meant to hear. She was 24 years old, the only child of a healer named Mara, who lived on the eastern edge of Ashwood, the smallest and poorest of the 7 wolf kingdoms. Sarah had grown up learning the names of herbs, not the names of kings. She knew how to treat a fever, how to set a broken bone, how to sit quietly beside someone in pain without saying a word. She was not ambitious. She was not bold. She was, by almost every measure the wolf world used to judge worth, completely ordinary. Which is why, when she received the sealed summons 3 days before the blood moon ceremony, she thought it was a mistake. The summons bore the iron stamp of Kael Drevan, Alpha King of the Iron Vale, ruler of the largest and most powerful kingdom in the known wolf world. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and entirely without warmth. He had never lost a negotiation, never walked away from a challenge, and never once made a decision that was not calculated to serve his own ends. People respected him the way they respected cold weather, not with love, with necessity. His summons said only that Sarah was to attend the blood moon ceremony as a guest of honor. No explanation, no context, just her name, written in firm black ink, with his seal pressed beneath it. Her mother held the letter for a long time without speaking. Sarah went. She arrived at the sacred grounds of Morven on the evening of the ceremony, wearing a plain gray dress and carrying nothing but a small satchel of supplies out of habit. The valley was enormous and lit with thousands of candles. Wolves from every kingdom filled the hillsides and the flat stone grounds below. She had never seen so many people in one place. She had never felt so invisible and so watched at the same time. An elder in white robes found her at the gate and guided her through the crowd without explanation. She was brought to the front of the assembly, near the great ceremonial dais where the Morven stone stood. The stone was ancient, larger than a house, carved with runes that no living wolf could fully read. It had stood in that valley for 500 years. According to the oldest stories, it would one day glow for the wolf, chosen to lead all kingdoms together, not through force, but through something the old texts called true standing. No one knew exactly what that meant. No one had ever seen the stone react to anything. Kael Drevan stepped onto the dais, just as the moon reached its highest point. The crowd went silent the moment he appeared. He was exactly as Sarah had imagined from the stories. Tall, composed, radiating the kind of authority that did not ask for your attention, but simply took it. He wore no crown that night. He didn't need one. His presence was enough. He looked out over the crowd for a long moment, and then his eyes landed on Sarah. She felt her heart drop into her stomach. He walked to the edge of the dais and extended his hand to her. An elder appeared beside Sarah and gently guided her forward. She climbed the 3 stone steps in a daze, and when she reached the top, Kael placed his hand firmly on her shoulder and turned to face the crowd. He announced that she was his chosen mate, his queen. The valley erupted. Some wolves cheered out of loyalty. Some gasped in shock. A few of the alpha daughters who had spent years preparing for this exact moment stood perfectly still with expressions that revealed nothing, though their stillness said everything. Above the dais, held by 2 elders on long ceremonial poles, was a golden crown. It had not been worn in over a century. It was waiting for her. Sarah looked at it. Then she looked at Kael's hand on her shoulder, firm and certain, the hand of a man who had never once been told no. And she thought about the night before. She had gone to the Elder Caves before dawn to gather moonflower, which only grew in the damp stone hollows near the valley's northern edge. She had done it without thinking, the way she always gathered herbs when she was nervous, because moving her hands and focusing on small living things helped quiet the noise in her head. She had not meant to overhear anything, but the cave system carried sound in strange ways, and when she rounded a low bend in the stone passage, the voices of men reached her clearly before she saw the glow of their lanterns. She stopped. She pressed herself against the wall. She listened. Kale was speaking to 4 members of the High Council of Elders, men who were supposed to be independent arbiters of wolf law. He was speaking to them the way a manager speaks to employees, which already told Sarah something important about how independent they really were. He explained the plan in plain terms. The mate bond she would feel at the ceremony, the pull toward him that was supposed to be a sacred and unmanufactured thing, had been prepared using a method from an old text that most wolves believed destroyed. It was not a true bond, it was a crafted one. A chemical reaction introduced into the ceremonial incense that would trigger, in any unmated Omega female within close proximity. She would feel it. She would believe it. And because she was an Omega from a family with no political connections and no power of any kind, she would have no reason and no ability to question it or refuse it. With her as his queen, Kale would have everything he needed to present the Morven Accords to the 6 lesser kingdoms. The Accords were a treaty that sounded, in the language they were written in, like a framework for peace and cooperation. What they actually were was a legal mechanism for dissolving the independence of every kingdom except Iron Vale. Once signed, the other alphas would answer to Kale. Their resources, their warriors, their land would all fall under Iron Vale jurisdiction, permanently. And the queen beside him, the quiet healer girl from Ashwood, with no family and no allies, would give the whole thing a face of gentleness. She would make it look like unity rather than control. Sarah stood in that cold stone passage for a very long time after the voices faded. She thought about her mother, who had spent 30 years healing wolves who could not afford to pay her, who had never once asked for recognition or rank. She thought about the families in Ashwood, who scraped together enough food each winter, because Iron Vale's trade routes cut them off from the better markets. She thought about the she-wolves she had grown up beside, strong and capable women, who had been told their whole lives that their worth depended on who they stood next to, rather than what they knew and what they did. She picked up her herbs and walked back to her tent. She did not sleep. Now she stood on the dais, with 10,000 wolves watching her, and a golden crown hanging in the air above her head. She looked at Kale Dravon one more time. He met her eyes with perfect confidence. He had planned everything. He had accounted for everything. He had not accounted for her. She stepped back from him, gently but clearly, so that his hand fell from her shoulder. She said, in a voice that was quiet, but steady and completely unmistakable, "I refuse." The silence that followed was unlike anything she had ever heard. It was the silence of thousands of people experiencing something their minds had no prepared category for. Then the ground moved. Not violently, not like an earthquake. It was a deep, low vibration, the kind that moved up through the soles of her feet and into her chest. And then the Morven stone, which had stood cold and gray and unreacting for 500 years, began to glow. The light started at the base and moved upward slowly, filling every carved groove in the ancient surface, until the whole stone was lit from within, warm and golden, like something that had been sleeping for a very long time and had finally decided to wake up. No one spoke. The 2 elders holding the ceremonial crown lowered it slowly, as if even they were unsure of what they were witnessing. Kale's composure, for the first time in memory, cracked. It was small, just a slight tightening around his eyes, a fraction of a second where the certainty left his face. But Sarah saw it, and so did the alphas standing nearest the dais. She turned and walked down the 3 stone steps and back into the crowd, which parted for her without anyone seeming to decide to do so. The chaos that followed was something she heard rather than saw, because she kept walking. Within hours, the word spread across the valley and then across every kingdom connected by Messenger Wolf and Fast Rider. What had happened, what the stone had done, what it meant. The stone, according to the oldest texts, did not respond to rank or bloodline or ceremony. It responded to something the ancient wolves called true standing, which the scholars had argued about for centuries without agreement. That night, watching the footage of the glow described in every account that traveled outward from Morven, most wolves arrived at the same quiet understanding, without needing a scholar to explain it. The stone had responded to someone choosing truth over safety. Kale moved quickly. He attempted to have Sarah formally charged with disrupting a sacred ceremony and brought back to Morven for judgment. The High Council of Elders, the same 4 men she had heard in the cave, prepared to authorize it. But 3 things happened that stopped them. First, Sarah had already written down everything she heard in the cave, in careful and precise detail, and she had given the pages to the healer networks that ran between all 7 kingdoms before she left the valley. The networks were made up of people like her mother, ordinary wolves with no political standing who trusted each other because they had been helping each other for generations. By the time Chaol issued his order, the pages had already reached hundreds of hands. Second, 2 of the Alpha Kings who had privately agreed to sign the Morven Accords withdrew their agreement and announced they were opening independent investigations into the claims in Sarah's account. Third, the Morven stone was still glowing. The elders refused to authorize her arrest. They told Chaol so in private, and then, when he pressed them, they told him so in writing. It was the first time in the history of Iron Vale that its own council had formally refused a direct order from the Alpha King. Chaol did not start a war over it. He was many things, but he was not careless. He understood that the moment he moved military force against the smaller kingdoms, he would lose the one thing he had always used more effectively than soldiers. He would lose the appearance of legitimacy. So he waited. And Sarah moved. Not with guards. Not with a title. She walked, sometimes rode, between the 6 smaller kingdoms over the following months. She brought with her the Ashwood Record, a document she had been quietly building since arriving home, filled with detailed accounts she collected from healers and low-ranking wolves in every pack she visited. Blocked trade routes, families who had lost members to forced re-ranking, resources that had been quietly redirected away from smaller packs and absorbed into Iron Vale systems for years. No one had ever written any of it down before, not because it had not happened, but because the wolves it happened to were the same kind of wolves as Sarah, the kind who had been told their whole lives that their observations did not count as history. She read the Ashwood Record aloud at the Grand Council 3 months after the Blood Moon ceremony. She read for 4 hours. The room was full of alphas and elders and ranking officials who had spent their entire careers in chambers like that one, and not one of them spoke while she talked. Chaol arrived at the end. He came with his full guard, standing at the back of the chamber, letting the sight of his warriors do the work of a threat. He offered one final terms to the assembly: accept the Morven Accords in their original form, or Iron Vale would begin enforcing them without consent, starting with Ashwood. He looked at Sarah when he said the last part. She looked back at him and said nothing. Then the Alpha of the Thornwood Pack stood up and placed his banner on the floor in front of her. Then the Alpha of the Blue River Pack did the same. Then the others, one at a time, without coordination, without a signal, each one placing their kingdom's banner on the stone floor of the chamber in the ancient gesture that meant collective witness. Whatever happens to her, happens to all of us. Chaol's guard shifted. Several of them had family in the smaller packs. Several of them had read the Ashwood Record. None of them moved forward. Chaol stood alone in a room full of wolves who were no longer afraid of him. He walked out. The Morven Accords were formally dissolved the following week. A new Inter-Kingdom Council was established with representation from every pack, including the Omega communities that had never held a seat at any table in 500 years of wolf governance. Sarah went home. She went back to her mother's healing house in Ashwood. She went back to her herbs and her records, and the long, quiet work of caring for people who needed caring for. She was offered the position of High Counselor. She declined. She was offered it again. She declined again. The third time, she asked the council to please find someone who wanted it, because there was plenty of that kind of person, and they deserved the chance. She said she was more useful as herself. The Morven stone remained gold. Travelers made the journey to the sacred valley to see it, and the elders who kept the grounds let them stand near it as long as they liked. No one touched it. No one tried to move it or study it too closely. The older elders, the ones who had spent their lives reading the ancient texts, said the stone would remain lit as long as the choice that woke it was still alive in the world. They meant the choice itself, not the person. They meant the moment someone decides that truth is worth more than a crown. And somewhere in Ashwood, a healer who had once stood on a high stone dais in front of 10,000 wolves and said 2 quiet words that changed everything, was kneeling in the dirt outside her mother's house, pressing her fingers into the earth around a moonflower seedling, making sure it had enough room to grow.